There is something frightening about silence because it is rarely empty. Often it is a person sitting alone at night, troubled by a realization that came too late. Someone once had your presence, your trust, and your energy, treating it as if it would always be there. But now, the heavy absence of what they lost has become louder than any words they ever just overlooked. Deep inside, a shift begins, because the human soul has a dangerous habit of not fully recognizing value until loss forces awareness into consciousness. People can lie to the world and to themselves, hiding behind pride and distractions. But the unconscious mind remembers every genuine connection and every wound. When a person finally understands they destroyed something real, the mind turns against its own illusions as sleep, thoughts, and emotions change. Silence becomes one of the strangest forms of confession, because while most expect regret to arrive with dramatic apologies, the deepest realizations rarely appear that way. A person who knows they made a massive mistake may never openly admit it at first. Yet their quietness slowly exposes everything they try to hide. This happens because the human psyche struggles to remain at peace after harming something deeply meaningful. Even when the conscious mind attempts to justify the past, the deeper layers of personality continue carrying the emotional weight. At first, this silence can appear cold or indifferent, but it eventually morphs into a heavy psychological pressure that is entirely inescapable. The individual starts thinking far more than speaking, privately replaying conversations, and remembering the exact details they once ignored. This internal pressure builds because meaningful emotional connections do not simply vanish just because someone chose to walk away from them. The ego naturally tries to protect itself from the shame of causing pain, desperately wanting to believe it was justified or unaffected. Yet, this profound silence ultimately exposes the brutal conflict happening inside, proving the unconscious remembers emotional truth long after the ego pretends to move on. Their behavior and energy shift as they become unusually reflective, observing from a distance and withdrawing from distractions, because the inner world has grown louder than external noise. Regret begins not with confession, but with this profound emotional disturbance and the psychological force of absence confronting them. What was once taken for granted suddenly gains immense emotional value, forcing the mind to return to unfinished moments, seeking resolution. A person who once ignored your presence may suddenly feel surrounded by reminders of you. As their silence begins carrying an intense emotional tension, they hesitate, appear, and disappear, caught in a desperate silent struggle between their pride and the emotional truth. The deeper the connection was, the harder it becomes to escape the realization of what was lost, making silence far more revealing than manipulated language. While people can easily lie through speech and perform confidence, silence ruthlessly exposes the emotional chaos they are desperately trying to control. A person haunted by regret cannot silence the unconscious mind forever, and the truth eventually surfaces through behaviors and reactions they themselves do not solve. Understand, what they refuse to say directly expresses itself indirectly, because the soul naturally moves toward truth, even when the ego resists it. The unconscious mind holds everything carrying real meaning, storing emotional experiences as living psychological energy rather than simple facts. Many foolishly believe forgetting is a conscious decision, assuming distractions and denial will naturally cause the past to disappear. However, the more meaningful a connection was, the more powerful its permanent imprint remains embedded within the deeper layers of the personality. Even if the conscious mind stops thinking about someone temporarily, The unconscious continues carrying their emotional presence silently in the background. A song, a place, or a random silence can suddenly awaken buried memories, confusing a conscious mind that believed the situation was finished. Ultimately, the psyche never fully releases unfinished experiences, leaving an internal tension that constantly demands attention and refuses to let them escape. The conscious ego easily creates excuses, blaming timing or circumstances to avoid guilt. But the unconscious always knows when something truly valuable has been damaged. This inner conflict between self-image and deep truth slowly alters behavior and identity, as real psychological regret develops only after pride's distractions fade and absence forces the mind to replay memories with heavy emotional weight. Dreams become crucial here, bypassing the ego through symbols to reveal raw truths about someone they claim to no longer care about. It is within this haunting quiet that the human psyche is forced to face the reality of what it threw away. The unconscious forms associations based on depth rather than convenience, which is why a person can meet many others and still find you entirely irreplaceable. Genuine bonds alter the very structure of the inner world, awakening parts of the personality that ordinary relationships can never touch, leaving a permanent imprint that shapes desires and fears from beneath awareness. Tragically, the human mind naturally becomes familiar with presence, turning consistent affection and emotional support psychologically invisible until it is gone. People foolishly assume these deep connections are permanently accessible, only awakening to their immense value once absence abruptly strips away the emotional comfort they took for granted. Loss acts as the ultimate force that breaks illusion, collapsing familiar routines and forcing the psyche to confront a cold reality without any distractions. Though pride initially tries to minimize the damage by claiming the bond wasn't special, new conversations quickly feel superficial and achievements feel strangely incomplete without that shared connection. The realization becomes devastatingly powerful when they recognize that you offered a rare emotional safety, understanding, and authenticity that cannot be found anywhere else. Ultimately, their perception permanently shifts, causing once insignificant details, a look, a simple conversation, or a shared silence, to replay endlessly as a painful internal confession. The unconscious starts gathering emotional evidence that the connection mattered far more than the ego admitted. What was once ignored becomes unforgettable. This is why some people become haunted by memories long after separation. The psyche is attempting to process the emotional truth of what was lost. There is also a deeper psychological reason why absence creates awareness. Human beings often define value through emotional contrast. People understand warmth more deeply after experiencing coldness. They understand connection more deeply after loneliness. In the same way, loss reveals emotional importance because the mind finally experiences life without the presence that once balanced it internally. The emotional gap becomes impossible to ignore. Sometimes this realization changes a person completely. Someone who once acted carelessly begins becoming more reflective. They start questioning their decisions, behavior, and emotional immaturity. The pain of losing something meaningful forces psychological growth because suffering has a unique ability to awaken self-awareness. A person may begin recognizing patterns within themselves they never noticed before, such as fear of vulnerability, emotional avoidance, pride, or the inability to appreciate genuine connection while it existed. The painful truth is that awareness often arrives too late. By the time someone fully understands the value of what they lost, the connection may already be damaged beyond repair. Yet even then, the realization continues transforming them internally. Loss becomes a psychological mirror that exposes hidden parts of the personality. It reveals emotional blindness, suppressed feelings, and unresolved fears. The absence of one meaningful person can completely alter the way someone understands love, relationships, and themselves. Because the human soul learns certain truths only through emptiness. When a person realizes they made a mistake, the change rarely begins through words. It begins internally, deep within the emotional structure of the psyche. Before someone admits regret openly, their behavior often starts shifting in subtle and unconscious ways. This happens because inner conflict creates psychological tension, and the human mind struggles to remain emotionally stable when two opposing truths exist at the same time. On one side, the ego wants to protect pride, maintain control, and avoid shame. On the other side, the deeper self recognizes that something meaningful was damaged or lost. This silent battle changes behavior long before confession ever arrives. A person experiencing inner conflict often becomes emotionally inconsistent. They may pull away, then suddenly return with attention or curiosity. They may act distant while secretly observing you. At times, they appear emotionally cold, but underneath that surface, the unconscious mind is becoming increasingly restless. This confusion is not random. It reflects the struggle between emotional truth and emotional defense. The conscious mind wants certainty, but the unconscious keeps forcing unresolved feelings back into awareness. This is why people who regret their actions often behave differently without fully understanding why. Their emotional reactions become stronger. Small reminders trigger unexpected feelings. They begin thinking about conversations, memories, or moments they once ignored. Even their body language can change. A person who once seemed emotionally unaffected may suddenly hesitate, become quieter, more reflective, or emotionally sensitive around the topic they are trying to avoid. The psyche reveals conflict indirectly because emotional truth cannot remain suppressed forever. There is also a psychological reason why inner conflict becomes exhausting over time. Maintaining emotional denial requires constant energy. A person must repeatedly convince themselves that they do not care, the loss was necessary, or that their actions were justified. The unconscious mind does not stop communicating simply because the ego wants silence. The deeper self continues sending emotional signals through anxiety, regret, dreams, intrusive thoughts, and emotional discomfort. Eventually, the individual becomes tired of fighting themselves internally. Dreams negate this internal tension often changes the way a person sees the world. They begin noticing emotional emptiness where they once felt certainty. Other relationships may start feeling shallow or emotionally disconnected because unresolved guilt changes perception. Someone who once avoided emotional depth may suddenly crave understanding honesty, or emotional closeness. This transformation happens because painful self-awareness forces the personality to confront hidden weaknesses. Inner conflict also affects identity. A person begins questioning the image they had of themselves. They may have believed they were strong, rational, or emotionally detached, but realizing they hurt someone meaningful creates a fracture within that self-image. The mind struggles to reconcile the difference between who they thought they were and who they're detached. Revealed. This creates emotional instability because the psyche naturally seeks psychological balance. Over time, these inner contradictions begin influencing choices and behavior more strongly. A person may become softer, more emotionally open, or more careful with others. In some cases, they attempt reconnection because the emotional pressure becomes impossible to ignore. In other cases, they remain silent, but internally transformed by the awareness of what they lost. The deeper the emotional connection was, the more powerful the internal conflict becomes, because meaningful relationships affect not only emotions, but the structure of the personality itself. Human beings often believe that connections exist only through physical presence, conversation, or visible interaction, but emotional bonds operate on a much deeper psychological level. When two people share a meaningful emotional connection, something lasting is created within the unconscious mind. Even after distance, silence, or separation, the emotional imprint of that person continues living internally. This is why some individuals remain emotionally present long after they are physically gone. The energy between two people does not simply disappear because communication ends. The psyche continues carrying the emotional impact, leaving permanent psychological traces tied to identity, safety, and vulnerability. Over time, voices, gestures, and conversations form deep internal patterns, meaning that while the conscious mind attempts to move forward logically, the unconscious continues reacting emotionally to what is now a permanent part of the inner world. This explains why memories, songs, and places suddenly trigger intense emotions without warning or explanation. As absence removes physical distractions and amplifies psychological awareness, the mind begins focusing deeply on emotional memory, creating a strange internal tension where an invisible connection remains heavily active because unresolved emotional energy naturally seeks expression. This emotional imprint quickly alters behavior, causing a person to unconsciously compare new people to the one they lost, searching for familiar qualities but failing to find that unique psychological depth. Because genuine bonds activate untouched parts of the personality, the body itself begins to carry this memory within the nervous system, translating regret and longing into restlessness, poor sleep, and a heavy physical exhaustion. This creates an intense frustration because the ego desperately craves emotional but independence. Yet, the unconscious completely overrides conscious control by clinging to the attachment. Ultimately, these deep connections cannot be erased because certain individuals become part of a person's personal transformation, permanently altering their emotional awareness and self-understanding long after physical separation occurs. Real transformation does not begin the moment a person suffers, but rather the moment they finally understand why they are suffering and confront the deeper truth behind their choices. Many people experience pain without becoming wiser because they choose to live in denial. But when someone genuinely realizes the damage they caused, a powerful shift occurs. This raw awareness fundamentally changes the structure of the personality because it forces the individual to see themselves without the comfort of illusion. The pride, excuses, and emotional avoidance they once used to protect their self-image start to completely collapse under the weight of reality. This internal collapse of the ego is the exact point where a person stops running from their mistakes and finally begins the journey of true inner transformation. Most human beings spend a large part of life protecting the ego. The ego wants comfort, control, and certainty. It wants to believe it was right or it had no choice. This psychological defense helps people avoid shame temporarily, but it also prevents growth. As long as a person refuses to face emotional truth, they remain trapped inside the same unconscious patterns. They continue hurting others in similar ways because they never recognize the deeper conflict within themselves. Transformation becomes impossible without awareness because unconscious behavior repeats itself automatically. The moment realization appears, however, the inner world begins changing. A person suddenly sees the emotional consequences of their actions clearly. They recognize the pain they caused, the connection they damaged, or the value they failed to appreciate. This awareness often arrives quietly. Sometimes it happens during loneliness, silence, or emotional loss. Sometimes it appears after repeated failures in relationships. The unconscious mind slowly gathers emotional truth until denial can no longer survive. This realization creates psychological discomfort because the individual now faces two versions of themselves at once. One version is the identity they believed in. The other is the truth revealed through their actions. The mind struggles to reconcile these opposites. A person who saw themselves as emotionally strong may suddenly recognize emotional immaturity. Someone who believed they were independent may discover they were avoiding vulnerability out of fear. This confrontation with the shadow self becomes painful because it destroys comforting illusions. Yet this pain is necessary for transformation. Without discomfort, people rarely change deeply. Emotional suffering forces self-reflection. It pushes hidden fears, insecurities, and unconscious behaviors into awareness. A person begins questioning why they acted the way they did. They start recognizing patterns they once ignored, such as fear of intimacy, fear of abandonment, pride, emotional avoidance, or the inability to express genuine emotion. What was once unconscious slowly becomes conscious. As awareness grows, behavior naturally changes. The person becomes more reflective and emotionally careful. They begin understanding the emotional weight of their actions instead of acting impulsively. Sometimes they develop empathy because they now understand pain from the inside. Their priorities shift. External validation becomes less important than emotional honesty. They may begin valuing authenticity, connection, and emotional depth more than ego or control, because the realization changed their inner perception of life itself. Transformation also changes relationships. A person who becomes self-aware often starts communicating differently, listening differently, and reacting differently. The emotional walls they once depended on begin weakening because they understand the loneliness those defenses created. They no longer see vulnerability as weakness. In the same way, true realization permanently alters the psyche, because once emotional truth becomes conscious, the individual can no longer fully return to ignorance. The awareness continues shaping their identity, decisions, emotional responses, and understanding of human connection from deep within the soul itself. In the end, the human soul cannot escape emotional truth forever. A person may hide behind silence, pride, distance, or denial, but the unconscious mind continues carrying what truly mattered. When someone realizes they made a mistake, the change does not begin outside. It begins deep within the psyche. Loss creates awareness. Regret creates inner conflict. And emotional truth slowly transforms the personality from within. Some connections are not ordinary. They leave permanent marks on the mind, heart, and soul. And once a person truly understands the value of what they lost, they are never completely the same again. This is the power of realization. This is the power of emotional awakening. And this is why awareness has the ability to change everything. Thank you all for listening with an open mind and heart. I truly hope these words gave you a deeper understanding of human emotions, relationships, and the hidden movements of the unconscious mind. May you continue growing in wisdom, self-awareness, and emotional strength. Good luck on your journey through life, and may you always recognize the value of genuine connections before silence and loss are forced to teach it for you.